The courtroom fell silent as the black man, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, calmly rose to his feet. His measured gaze swept the room before landing squarely on the smug officer sitting at the plaintiff's table. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but laced with authority, "before we proceed, I'd like to disclose my professional background." All eyes turned to the man, puzzled by his sudden statement. The officer smirked, leaning back in his chair. The judge nodded, signaling him to continue. "I am not simply a defendant in this case," the man said, pausing for dramatic effect. "My name is Samuel Preston, and I serve as a federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and the officer's smirk evaporated. Samuel's words hung in the air like a thunderclap, leaving everyone stunned. The officer shifted uneasily in his seat, beads of sweat forming on his brow. His attorney's face turned a pale shade of gray, realizing the gravity of their situation. The judge adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Preston," she said, her tone measured, "are you saying that this lawsuit was filed against you without the plaintiff knowing who you are?" Samuel's lips curved into a faint smile, but his eyes betrayed the fire simmering beneath his calm exterior. "That would appear to be the case, Your Honor. But I believe that fact is about to become very relevant." The courtroom buzzed with whispers as the officer's hands clenched the edge of the table. Samuel's revelation had appended everything, and the air was thick with tension. What could possibly happen next? 3 months earlier, Samuel had no idea his life was about to collide with a case that would test his resolve. It began on a sweltering summer evening in downtown Chicago. Samuel, off-duty and dressed in casual clothes, had just finished dinner with friends. As he strolled toward his car, the flashing lights of a patrol car stopped him in his tracks. "Hey, you." The voice was sharp, commanding, and unmistakably accusatory. Samuel turned to see Officer Greg Larson approaching, hand on his holstered gun. Samuel remained calm, his hands visible, and his voice steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" Larson's gaze was cold and assessing, as though he'd already made up his mind. "We've had reports of a black man breaking into cars in this area. You match the description." Samuel raised an eyebrow, gesturing toward his freshly waxed Tesla parked just a few feet away. "This is my car. I can show you my ID and registration." But Larson wasn't interested in explanations. "Hands on the car," he barked. Samuel complied, though a flicker of frustration crossed his face. The officer's partner stood nearby, watching silently but offering no intervention. Larson patted him down roughly, pulling Samuel's wallet from his pocket. "You're clean," Larson muttered, his tone tinged with disappointment. But instead of apologizing, he handed Samuel a citation. "Consider this a warning. Don't hang around here too long." Samuel took the ticket, his jaw tightening. He glanced at the officer's badge, G. Larson, making a mental note of the name. Without another word, he got into his car and drove off. What Larson didn't realize was that Samuel wasn't just another man to be dismissed. He was a prosecutor with a reputation for dismantling systemic injustice, and this encounter sparked something deep within him. A week later, Larson filed a civil lawsuit against Samuel, alleging defamation and harassment. According to Larson's claim, Samuel had intimidated him after the traffic stop, a bold-faced lie Samuel knew he could disprove. Samuel didn't rush to respond. Instead, he quietly began gathering evidence. He requested body cam footage, reviewed Larson's record, and contacted a few trusted colleagues who had experience dealing with problematic officers. What he uncovered was more damning than he could have imagined. Larson had a history of targeting black men, filing false reports, and initiating frivolous lawsuits to cover his tracks. The case escalated when Samuel was served court papers. His friends urged him to settle or dismiss the case, but Samuel had other plans. He saw this as an opportunity, not just to clear his name but to expose Larson's pattern of misconduct. The courtroom murmurs died down as Samuel took his seat, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. The judge called for order, and the trial proceeded, but Larson's confidence had clearly wavered. Samuel's revelation had shaken the officer to his core. For now, Samuel played his cards close to his chest. He had evidence that could dismantle Larson's case and ruin his career, but he wasn't ready to reveal his hand. Not yet. The judge turned to Larson's attorney. "Counsel, do you wish to proceed, or would you like a recess to reconsider your position?" The attorney hesitated, glancing at Larson, whose face was ashen. "Your Honor, we'd like a brief recess." The judge nodded, banging her gavel. Recess granted. Court will resume in 30 minutes. As the courtroom emptied, Samuel leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He had waited for this moment, and now it was finally here. The wheels of justice were in motion, and he intended to see it through, no matter what. The courtroom buzzed with tension as people whispered in small groups, speculating about what Samuel Preston might have up his sleeve. Larson's attorney led him into a small meeting room down the hall, closing the door behind them. The officer paced nervously, his confidence now replaced with palpable dread. "Why didn't you tell me he was a federal prosecutor?" the attorney hissed, his voice low but furious. "I didn't know." Larson shot back. "He looked like just another punk with a fancy car. How was I supposed to know?" The attorney rubbed his temples, trying to think. "We need to regroup. This isn't just about winning the case anymore. If this goes sideways, it could cost you your badge." Larson scowled, slamming his fist on the table. "He's not going to win. He's just trying to scare us." The attorney wasn't so sure. The look in Samuel's eyes earlier had been unnerving, cold, calculating, and confident. This wasn't a man who could be intimidated. Back in the courtroom, Samuel sat calmly at the defense table, sipping water and reviewing his notes. His attorney, Michelle Carter, leaned over whispering, "You think they'll try to back out?" Samuel shook his head. "Not yet. Larson's ego won't let him. He thinks he can bluff his way through this." Michelle chuckled softly. "Good. Let them try. It'll make their downfall even sweeter." Samuel's mind drifted back to the events leading up to this moment. After Larson's lawsuit had been filed, Samuel had done his homework, digging into the officer's past with the precision of a seasoned investigator. What he found painted a chilling picture. Larson had a long history of complaints filed against him, most of which mysteriously disappeared before they could be investigated. The few cases that did make it through revealed a pattern of racial profiling, excessive force, and false accusations. One case in particular stood out. A young black man named Andre Williams had been arrested by Larson a year earlier for allegedly resisting arrest. Andre, a college student with no prior record, insisted he had done nothing wrong, but Larson's word had been enough to convict him. Samuel tracked down Andre's family and discovered that the young man's life had been derailed by the incident. He had lost his scholarship, his job, and his future. This wasn't just about Samuel clearing his name anymore. It was about holding Larson accountable for the damage he had done to so many lives. The courtroom doors opened, and the bailiff called everyone back to their seats. Larson and his attorney returned, both looking tense but determined to proceed. The judge took her seat, her expression as unreadable as ever. "Counsel," the judge said, addressing Larson's attorney, "are you prepared to continue?" "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney replied, though his voice lacked conviction. The trial resumed, and Larson's team began presenting their case. They claimed that Samuel had made veiled threats during their encounter and had used his position to intimidate Larson afterward. To the untrained ear, their argument might have sounded plausible, but Samuel's attorney quickly dismantled it during cross-examination. "Officer Larson," Michelle began, her tone sharp but professional, "you've testified that Mr. Preston made threatening remarks toward you. Can you recall his exact words?" Larson shifted uncomfortably. He said, he'd make me regret this." Michelle raised an eyebrow. "And did he elaborate on how he intended to do that?" "No," Larson admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "So you're basing your entire claim of intimidation on a vague statement that could mean any number of things?" Larson glared at her, but didn't respond. Michelle turned to the jury, letting the silence linger for a moment before continuing. "Let's move on," she said, her tone lighter but no less pointed. "You've also claimed that Mr. Preston used his position as a federal prosecutor to pressure you. Can you provide any evidence to support this claim? Emails, phone calls, witnesses?" Larson's jaw tightened. "No, but—" "Thank you, Officer Larson. That will be all." The officer's frustration was evident as he stepped down from the stand. His attorney tried to salvage the situation, but the damage had been done. Samuel watched calmly, knowing that this was only the beginning. As the day's proceedings came to a close, the judge announced that the trial would continue the following morning. Samuel gathered his things, preparing to leave, when Larson approached him in the hallway. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Larson sneered, his voice low and venomous. Samuel paused, turning to face him. His expression remained neutral, but his words cut like a blade. You should have done your homework, Officer Larson. Ignorance is no excuse for what you've done. Larson's face darkened, but before he could respond, Michelle stepped between them. Back off, she said firmly. If you have something to say, save it for the courtroom. Larson muttered something under his breath and walked away, leaving Samuel and Michelle standing in the empty hallway. He's getting desperate, Michelle said, watching Larson disappear around the corner. Good, Samuel replied. That's when people make mistakes. Later that evening, Samuel sat alone in his apartment, reviewing his notes and preparing for the next day. The evidence he had collected was solid, but he knew the battle wasn't over. Larson was a cornered animal, and cornered animals were dangerous. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed with a text from Michelle. Bodycam footage just arrived. You're going to want to see this. Samuel's pulse quickened as he opened his laptop and clicked the file. The grainy video began to play, and within seconds, his face hardened. Larson's actions during their initial encounter were worse than Samuel had anticipated. The footage ended, and Samuel leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This was it, the piece of evidence that could shatter Larson's case. But as satisfying as it was to finally have proof, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something even bigger was about to unfold. Tomorrow would be another long day in court, and Samuel was ready. What he didn't know was that Larson had one last trick up his sleeve, a desperate move that would either save him or destroy him completely. The courtroom was packed the next morning, buzzing with reporters and curious onlookers who had caught wind of the trial. Samuel and Michelle arrived early, their calm confidence contrasting sharply with Larson's nervous energy. The officer sat at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. Samuel glanced at the jury box as the members filed in. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and skepticism. He knew the battle ahead wasn't just about presenting evidence, but also about winning their trust. Larson's claims were flimsy at best, but Samuel understood that narratives, even false ones, could be powerful if left unchecked. The judge entered, and the courtroom settled into silence. She wasted no time, calling for Larson's attorney to proceed with their next witness. Your Honor, Larson's attorney began, we'd like to call Officer Anthony Delgado to the stand. Samuel's brow furrowed. Delgado was Larson's longtime partner, and his presence was a clear attempt to bolster Larson's credibility. Delgado took the stand, his uniform crisp and his demeanor rehearsed. Officer Delgado, Larson's attorney started, can you tell the court about your experience working with Officer Larson? Delgado nodded, his tone measured. I've worked with Officer Larson for over 5 years. He's always been professional and dedicated to his duty. And were you present during the incident involving Mr. Preston? Yes, I was, Delgado replied. I witnessed the entire interaction. Samuel's jaw tightened. Delgado's presence during the incident wasn't a surprise, but the next words out of his mouth were, Officer Larson acted appropriately given the circumstances. Mr. Preston was uncooperative and made comments that could be perceived as threatening. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Samuel remained outwardly calm, but Michelle leaned in, whispering, he's lying. I know, Samuel murmured. Let's see how far they're willing to go. Larson's attorney pressed further, attempting to paint Samuel as the aggressor. Delgado's testimony was carefully worded, leaving just enough ambiguity to cast doubt. But Samuel knew the truth was about to come crashing down. When it was Michelle's turn to cross-examine, she approached Delgado with an air of quiet authority. Officer Delgado, you've testified that you were present during the incident with my client. Is that correct? Yes. And you've stated that Mr. Preston was uncooperative. Can you clarify what you mean by uncooperative? Delgado hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He questioned why he was being stopped. Michelle smiled faintly. So, asking why he was being stopped is what you consider uncooperative? Well, it was his tone. Let's talk about tone, Michelle interrupted, her voice sharp. Was Mr. Preston raising his voice? Cursing? Making any overt threats? No, Delgado admitted, his confidence wavering. Thank you, Officer Delgado. Now, you also mentioned that Officer Larson's actions were appropriate. Would you agree that using racial slurs is appropriate behavior for an officer of the law? The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on Delgado. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Larson, who avoided his gaze. No, of course not. Michelle leaned in, her voice dropping slightly. Did Officer Larson use racial slurs during his interaction with Mr. Preston? Delgado hesitated, his face pale. Not that I heard. Michelle raised an eyebrow, then turned to the judge. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to introduce new evidence into the record. The judge nodded. Proceed. Michelle walked to the defense table, retrieving a laptop and a projector. She connected the equipment, and within moments, the courtroom lights dimmed as a video began to play. It was the body cam footage. The grainy video showed the moment Larson had stopped Samuel. The audio was clear, capturing every word. At first, the interaction seemed routine, albeit unnecessarily aggressive on Larson's part. But then came the bombshell. Another one of you people thinking you're above the law, Larson's voice sneered on the recording. You're lucky I don't drag you in for just existing. The room erupted into murmurs. Delgado's face turned ashen, and Larson's attorney shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This footage was not disclosed during discovery. The judge raised her hand, silencing him. Overruled. This is highly relevant to the case. The video continued, showing Larson's dismissive attitude and unprofessional behavior. Samuel remained calm throughout the interaction, his responses measured and respectful. The footage ended, and the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Michelle turned to the jury. This is the man who claims to have been intimidated by my client. A man who clearly has no respect for the people he's sworn to protect. I'll let you decide who the real victim is here. The break in proceedings was tense. Larson and his attorney retreated into another meeting room, their hushed conversation heated. Delgado slipped out of the courtroom, his head low, avoiding the reporters waiting outside. Samuel sat quietly at the defense table, his expression unreadable. Michelle leaned over. That was a game changer, she whispered. They're rattled. They should be, Samuel replied. But Larson isn't done yet. He'll push harder now that he's cornered. As if on cue, Larson's attorney approached the bench after the recess, requesting to call Larson back to the stand. It was a desperate move, and Samuel knew it. Larson's testimony was bound to be full of inconsistencies, but the officer was determined to salvage his case. Larson took the stand, his smugness replaced with a defensive edge. His attorney guided him through his testimony, trying to frame the body cam footage as out of context. But when Michelle began her cross-examination, Larson's composure crumbled. Officer Larson, she began, her tone calm but firm, do you deny that the voice in the body cam footage is yours? No, Larson admitted grudgingly. And do you deny using the words you people during your interaction with my client? Larson's face reddened. I might have said that, but what? Michelle pressed. Is there any context in which that statement would be appropriate? Larson stammered, his frustration mounting. I didn't mean it like that. Michelle stepped closer, her voice rising slightly. Then how did you mean it, Officer Larson? Because to me, and likely to everyone else in this room, it sounds like racial bias. The tension in the room was palpable as Larson struggled to respond. Michelle didn't give him the chance. No further questions, Your Honor, she said, stepping back to her seat. As the day ended, the courtroom buzzed with speculation. Larson's case was unraveling, but Samuel knew there was still more to come. As he left the courthouse, he spotted a group of reporters waiting outside. Larson stood among them, flanked by his attorney, giving a statement to the press. Samuel watched from a distance as Larson played the victim, claiming he was being unfairly targeted by a vindictive prosecutor. It was a bold move, but one that would ultimately backfire. As Samuel walked to his car, his phone buzzed. It was Michelle. We just got another lead, she said, her voice urgent. You're going to want to see this. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he climbed into his car. Larson was running out of options, and the next move would either end this battle, or escalate it to a level no one saw coming. The courthouse was still buzzing with the fallout from the body cam footage as Samuel drove to Michelle's office that evening. The city lights blurred past the window, but his focus was on her cryptic message. Whatever she had uncovered, it had to be significant. Larson's performance on the stand had been disastrous, but Samuel knew desperate men often resorted to desperate measures. When Samuel arrived, Michelle was already at her desk, her face lit by the glow of her laptop screen. She motioned him inside, closing the door behind him. This just came in, she said, spinning the laptop toward him. On the screen was a folder containing files from a whistleblower who had once worked with Larson. I reached out to some contacts, and someone finally came through. You won't believe what's in here. Samuel opened the first file, and his stomach turned. It was a series of internal complaints filed by junior officers and citizens against Larson. Allegations of falsified reports, intimidation, and outright lies were detailed in painstaking clarity. Some cases even mentioned Larson planting evidence to secure arrests. Many of these complaints had been quietly dismissed, but the patterns were undeniable. Michelle clicked on another file, a spreadsheet listing names. "This," she said, pointing to the screen, "is a list of individuals Larson has wrongfully accused or arrested over the years. And get this, every single one of them is Black or Latino." Samuel's jaw tightened as he scrolled through the names. How has he gotten away with this for so long? "Connections," Michelle replied. "The guy's protected by a network of officers and higher-ups who've been sweeping his messes under the rug. But this? This blows the case wide open." Samuel leaned back in his chair, processing the weight of the information. "This isn't just about me anymore. We're talking about a systemic problem." Michelle nodded. "Exactly. And if we play this right, Larson won't just lose this case. He'll take down everyone who's been covering for him." The next morning, court resumed with a noticeable shift in energy. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras flashing as Samuel entered with Michelle. Larson sat at the plaintiff's table, his jaw clenched, and his attorney looked visibly stressed. Before the proceedings began, Michelle approached the bench with a motion to introduce the new evidence. Larson's attorney immediately objected, arguing that the files were obtained improperly and were irrelevant to the case. But Michelle was prepared. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "these documents directly relate to Officer Larson's credibility as a plaintiff and a witness. They establish a clear pattern of behavior that undermines his claims against my client." The judge studied the files for several tense moments before nodding. "Motion granted. The evidence is admissible." Larson's attorney slumped slightly in his chair, and Samuel caught a flicker of panic in Larson's eyes. The officer leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously, but it was too late. Michelle wasted no time. She began by calling a former officer who had worked under Larson to the stand. The man, visibly nervous but resolute, testified about Larson's unethical practices, including fabricating evidence and targeting minorities. His testimony was damning, but what came next was even more explosive. Michelle called Samuel to the stand. He took his place with the confidence of a man who had spent years in courtrooms. Michelle guided him through his testimony, allowing him to recount the events leading up to the lawsuit. "Mr. Preston," she said, her voice calm but deliberate, "did you at any point during your interaction with Officer Larson threaten him or use your position to intimidate him?" "Absolutely not," Samuel replied firmly. "I complied with every instruction he gave, despite the unnecessary aggression and lack of justification for the stop." Michelle nodded. "And how did Officer Larson respond to your cooperation?" Samuel's expression darkened slightly. "He issued me a citation without cause and made derogatory remarks about my race." Michelle turned to the jury, letting Samuel's words sink in. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit C, an analysis of Officer Larson's citation history." She projected a chart onto the screen, showing a glaring disparity. The majority of Larson's citations were issued to Black and Latino drivers, despite the demographics of the area he patrolled. The jury shifted uncomfortably, and Larson's attorney made a weak attempt to object, but the judge allowed the evidence to stand. During the lunch recess, Larson's attorney cornered Michelle in the hallway. "What's your endgame here?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "You're not just trying to win this case, you're trying to destroy him." Michelle didn't flinch. "He destroyed himself the moment he thought he could abuse his power without consequences. We're just holding him accountable." The attorney ran a hand through his hair, clearly exasperated. "You know this could blow back on more people than just Larson, right? Higher-ups, colleagues, even the department." "That's not my problem," Michelle said firmly. "If they were complicit, they deserve whatever's coming." When court resumed, Larson was visibly unraveling. He squirmed in his seat as Michelle presented witness after witness, each one adding another nail to the coffin of his credibility. Former colleagues, wrongfully accused individuals, and even community leaders testified about Larson's history of misconduct. The turning point came when Michelle introduced a recording from one of Larson's former partners. The audio captured Larson boasting about teaching those people a lesson and putting them in their place. The courtroom was silent as the recording played, the words echoing like a death knell for Larson's case. Larson's attorney scrambled to object, but the judge overruled him. The damage was done. As the day ended, Samuel and Michelle left the courthouse feeling a sense of momentum. But as they stepped outside, a black SUV pulled up to the curb. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his expression grim. "Mr. Preston," the man said, flashing a badge. "I'm Agent Carter with Internal Affairs. We need to talk." Samuel exchanged a glance with Michelle. Whatever this was, it wasn't over yet. The sudden appearance of the Internal Affairs agent sent a ripple of tension through Samuel and Michelle. The courthouse steps, usually buzzing with reporters, felt eerily still as the agent gestured toward the SUV. "Agent Carter," Samuel said, keeping his tone neutral, "I assume this isn't a social call." Carter's expression remained impassive. "It's about Officer Larson and the larger implications of this case. We believe you may have uncovered something that goes beyond a simple lawsuit." Samuel exchanged a glance with Michelle, who gave a subtle nod. "All right," Samuel said. "Let's talk." The ride in the SUV was quiet, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Carter finally broke the silence as they entered a secure federal building in downtown Chicago. "We've had our eye on Larson for a while," he began, leading Samuel and Michelle into a small conference room. "He's part of a larger network of officers involved in racial profiling and corruption. Until now, we didn't have enough to act. Your case changes that." Carter laid a file on the table, flipping it open to reveal a web of names and connections. "Larson's just one piece of the puzzle. We've traced his activities back to a group of officers who've been manipulating arrests and falsifying reports for years. It's systemic." Samuel studied the file, his mind racing. "And you think this case could expose the whole operation?" "It already has," Carter replied. "The evidence you've introduced in court has drawn attention. If we play this right, we can use the trial to gather more information and bring down the entire network." Michelle leaned forward, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "Are you asking us to become part of an investigation? Because this trial is already complicated enough." Carter nodded. "We're not asking for anything overt. Just continue presenting your case. The more you reveal, the more pressure we can apply behind the scenes." Samuel sat back, processing the request. "And what happens if Larson figures out he's being used as bait? He's already desperate." Carter's expression darkened. "Desperate people make mistakes. That's what we're counting on." The next day in court, the tension was palpable. Samuel could feel Larson's eyes on him as he entered the courtroom, the officer's gaze a mix of anger and unease. The plaintiff's table was a fortress of whispers and hurried notes as Larson's attorney scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Michelle wasted no time. She began the day by calling another witness, a former intern at the police department who had witnessed Larson altering evidence. The young woman's testimony was hesitant but damning, painting a picture of a man who had no qualms about bending the rules to suit his agenda. "Did you report what you saw?" Michelle asked, her voice gentle but firm. The intern hesitated. "I tried," she said finally. "But my supervisor told me to keep quiet. He said no one would believe me over an officer like Larson." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Michelle turned to the jury, her expression resolute. "This is the environment Officer Larson operated in, one where accountability was not just discouraged but actively suppressed." Larson's attorney attempted to discredit the intern, but her testimony had struck a nerve. The jury's expressions shifted, their skepticism toward Samuel's case giving way to something closer to outrage. During a recess, Larson stormed out of the courtroom, his attorney trailing behind him. Samuel watched from a distance as Larson's frustration boiled over, his voice carrying through the hallway. "This is a witch hunt," Larson snapped, slamming his fist against the wall. "They're trying to ruin me." His attorney tried to calm him down, but Larson was spiraling. Samuel caught Michelle's eye, and she gave a small knowing nod. Larson was cracking, just as they had anticipated. When court resumed, Larson's attorney attempted to mount a counteroffensive, calling a character witness to vouch for the officer's integrity. But the witness's testimony was weak, riddled with contradictions under cross-examination. By the end of the day, it was clear that Larson's case was unraveling faster than anyone had expected. As the court adjourned, Samuel and Michelle returned to her office to prepare for the next day. The stack of evidence and testimonies was growing, but so was the pressure. The trial had become a spectacle, and Samuel knew that the more attention it drew, the more dangerous it became. Just as they were wrapping up, Michelle's phone buzzed with a message. She read it, her expression tightening. "It's from Carter," she said, looking up at Samuel. They intercepted a communication between Larson and one of his former colleagues. "He's planning something." Samuel's pulse quickened. "What kind of something?" "They're not sure," Michelle replied. "But whatever it is, it's happening soon." The next morning, the courtroom was unusually tense. Larson sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape route. Samuel watched him closely, sensing that the officer was on the verge of making a move. It came during the cross-examination of another witness. Larson abruptly stood, interrupting the proceedings. "Your Honor," he said, his voice loud and shaky, "I have something to say." The judge frowned, clearly taken aback. "Officer Larson, you'll have your chance to testify during redirect. Please take your seat." But Larson didn't move. "This is all a setup," he blurted, his voice rising. "They're trying to frame me." The courtroom erupted into chaos as Larson's outburst escalated. The judge banged her gavel, demanding order, but Larson was beyond control. His attorney tried to pull him back, but the officer shook him off, pointing a finger at Samuel. "This man," Larson shouted, "he's been plotting against me from the start." Samuel remained seated, his expression calm but watchful. Larson's meltdown was playing out exactly as Carter had predicted, but it wasn't over yet. Whatever Larson was planning, it was clear that this was only the beginning. The courtroom descended into chaos as Larson's outburst echoed through the chamber. The judge, her patience worn thin, banged her gavel with authority. "Order in the court. Officer Larson, this is your final warning. Sit down, or I'll hold you in contempt." Larson hesitated, his chest heaving with barely contained anger. His attorney tugged on his sleeve, whispering urgently, but Larson's glare remained locked on Samuel. Slowly, he sat down, his movements jerky and tense. The judge exhaled sharply, turning her attention to the jury. "I must remind the members of the jury to disregard the plaintiff's outburst," she said firmly. "This trial will proceed in an orderly manner." Samuel exchanged a glance with Michelle, who scribbled a note and slid it across the table. "He's unraveling. We need to keep the pressure on." Samuel gave a small nod, his focus unwavering. Larson's meltdown was a sign that their strategy was working, but it also signaled something more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose. During the next recess, Samuel and Michelle retreated to a quiet conference room to regroup. Michelle tapped her pen against the table, her expression thoughtful. "Larson's reaction wasn't just desperation," she said. "It was calculated. He's trying to paint himself as the victim in front of the jury." Samuel leaned back, his arms crossed. "It's a gamble, and it might work if we're not careful. What's the next step?" Michelle flipped through her notes, her lips pursed. "We need to show the jury that his outburst isn't a one-off. It's part of a pattern of someone who abuses power and lacks self-control." Samuel nodded, but before he could respond, Michelle's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's Carter," she answered, putting the call on speaker. Carter's voice came through, tense and hurried. "We've got a situation. Larson made contact with one of his former colleagues last night, someone who's been implicated in the broader corruption network. We intercepted a conversation suggesting he's planning to tamper with evidence." Michelle's eyes widened. "Tamper how?" "Not sure yet," Carter admitted. "But he's desperate, and desperate people make reckless moves. Just keep an eye out for anything unusual." Samuel's jaw tightened. "If he's willing to go that far, we need to be ready." When court resumed, Michelle called her next witness, an independent forensic analyst who had reviewed the body cam footage and other evidence from Larson's history of misconduct. The analyst's testimony was detailed and methodical, dismantling Larson's credibility piece by piece. "Based on your analysis," Michelle asked, "is there any evidence to suggest that my client, Mr. Preston, acted in a threatening or intimidating manner during his encounter with Officer Larson?" "None whatsoever," the analyst replied. "In fact, the evidence suggests that Officer Larson's behavior was disproportionate and unprofessional." The jury's expressions shifted, their skepticism toward Samuel continuing to erode. Larson sat rigid at the plaintiff's table, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed he might crack a tooth. As the day wore on, the pressure on Larson became increasingly visible. His attorney attempted to salvage the case by redirecting the focus onto Samuel's background, but Michelle countered every argument with precision. By the time the court adjourned for the day, Larson looked like a man on the verge of collapse. Outside the courthouse, Samuel and Michelle lingered, discussing their next moves. A reporter approached, microphone in hand. "Mr. Preston, do you have any comment on Officer Larson's outburst earlier today?" Samuel's response was measured. "I'll let the evidence speak for itself. The truth will come out in court." As the reporter walked away, Michelle turned to Samuel. "You handled that well. But we need to stay vigilant. Larson's not done yet." Later that night, Samuel sat in his apartment, reviewing the day's events. His phone buzzed with a message from Carter. "Something's going down tomorrow. Be prepared." Samuel's stomach tightened. He didn't know what Larson had planned, but the stakes were higher than ever. The next morning, the courtroom was unusually quiet. The tension was palpable as everyone awaited the next phase of the trial. Michelle leaned over to Samuel, whispering, "Keep your eyes open. If Larson tries something, we need to be ready." The judge entered, calling the court to order. Larson's attorney began presenting their next piece of evidence, a grainy video that purported to show Samuel in an altercation with another officer. The jury leaned forward, intrigued. But as the video played, Michelle's eyes narrowed. Something was off. "Your Honor," she said, standing, "I'd like to request a short recess to verify the authenticity of this footage." Larson's attorney objected, but the judge granted the request. Michelle and Samuel stepped out, their minds racing. "That footage looks doctored," Michelle said, her voice low but urgent. "If Larson planted this, it could blow up in his face, but we need to prove it." Samuel nodded. "Let's move fast. If he's tampered with evidence, this could be the final nail in his coffin." Back in the courtroom, Larson sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands trembling slightly. His gaze darted around the room, and for the first time, Samuel saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. Whatever Larson was planning, it was about to come to light, and the consequences would be catastrophic. The courtroom doors swung open, and Michelle returned briskly, her face unreadable. Samuel followed, his expression calm but alert. The judge looked up, her gavel tapping lightly. "Counsel, are we prepared to proceed?" "Yes, Your Honor," Michelle said, standing. "However, we have serious concerns regarding the integrity of the video evidence presented by the plaintiff. Our preliminary analysis suggests it has been tampered with." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the jury exchanging surprised glances. Larson's attorney shot to his feet, his face a mask of feigned indignation. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a baseless accusation meant to distract from my client's legitimate claims." Michelle didn't flinch. "Your Honor, I've already submitted a motion for an independent forensic analysis of the footage. If this evidence has been manipulated, it would be a grave violation of both the court's trust and the integrity of these proceedings." The judge's sharp gaze swept between the attorneys before settling on Larson's visibly tense face. "I'll allow the motion," she said firmly. "Court is adjourned until the footage is verified." Outside the courthouse, Larson's attorney cornered him. "Greg, tell me you didn't tamper with that video." Larson's jaw tightened. "It's legit." "It better be," his attorney warned. "Because if it's not, this case is over, and you'll be facing charges of your own." But Larson didn't respond. He simply walked away, his hands clenched into fists. His mind was racing, calculating his next move. Meanwhile, Samuel and Michelle regrouped in her office, where the independent forensic analyst had already begun reviewing the video. The analyst paused the footage, zooming in on a distorted timestamp. "Here," he said, pointing to the screen. "The metadata has been altered. This segment of the video was spliced in from a different source." Michelle leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "Can you trace the original?" The analyst nodded. "It'll take some time, but yes." "Do it," Michelle said, her voice firm. "If we can prove Larson fabricated this evidence, it's game over." The next morning, the courtroom was electric with anticipation. Reporters jostled for seats, their cameras ready to capture every moment. Larson sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, his attorney whispering furiously in his ear. Samuel observed him from across the room, noting the faint sheen of sweat on Larson's brow. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Michelle stood, her demeanor poised but fierce. "Your Honor," she began, "our independent analysis confirms that the video evidence submitted by the plaintiff has been manipulated. The original footage was spliced with an unrelated incident to fabricate a false narrative." She turned to the jury, her voice rising with conviction. "This is not just a breach of ethical conduct. It's a blatant attempt to mislead this court. Gasps rippled through the room. Larson's attorney paled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But Larson remained motionless, his face a mask of poorly concealed panic. The judge's voice was cold. "Counsel, do you have an explanation for this?" Larson's attorney stammered. "Your Honor, I wasn't aware of any manipulation. If this occurred, it was without my knowledge." The judge's gaze shifted to Larson. "Officer Larson, as the plaintiff in this case, you are responsible for the evidence presented. Did you knowingly submit falsified footage?" The room held its collective breath. Larson opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence was deafening. As the forensic analyst took the stand to confirm the manipulation, Larson's fate seemed sealed. The jury's expressions hardened, their sympathy for his claims evaporating. Larson sat rigidly, his hands gripping the edge of the table. But just when it seemed the case was over, Larson stood abruptly, his voice breaking the tense silence. "Your Honor, I need to speak." The judge frowned. "Officer Larson, if you have something to say, you may consult with your attorney." "No," Larson said, shaking his head. "I need to say this now." The courtroom froze as Larson stepped toward the center, his movements deliberate but trembling. His attorney's protests fell on deaf ears. Larson faced the judge, his voice hoarse but loud enough to carry. "There's more to this than what's in this courtroom," he began, his eyes darting to Samuel. "I was following orders." Samuel's brow furrowed, but he stayed silent, watching as Larson's composure cracked. "Orders from who?" the judge asked, her voice cutting through the tension. Larson hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the gallery where several uniformed officers sat watching. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered. "Try me," the judge replied, her tone icy. But Larson shook his head. "I've said enough," he muttered, retreating to his seat. The judge stared at him for a long moment before turning to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will resume tomorrow. This court is adjourned." As the courtroom emptied, Michelle leaned toward Samuel. "He's scared. Whatever he's hiding, it's bigger than we thought." Samuel nodded, his expression grim. "And now he's trying to figure out how much of it he can keep buried." Outside the courthouse, Agent Carter was waiting. He pulled Samuel aside, his face tense. "That was the crack we needed," he said. "Larson just admitted there's a larger operation at play. Can we use that?" Samuel asked. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "We're already moving. But Larson's not the only one feeling the heat. Be careful, Preston. You're in the crosshairs now." Samuel nodded, the weight of Carter's words settling heavily on his shoulders. Whatever Larson was involved in, the web of corruption was starting to unravel, and Samuel was right at its center. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with an intensity that rivaled the trial's earlier days. Larson's cryptic remarks the previous day had set off a flurry of speculation. Reporters crowded the gallery, and whispers about a larger conspiracy rippled through the room. Samuel sat quietly, his face calm but his mind racing. Michelle leaned in, her voice low. "I've spoken to Carter. They're pressuring Larson behind the scenes, but we need to keep the jury focused on his misconduct. If we lose their attention, the broader implications won't matter." Samuel nodded. "Let's stick to the plan. His unraveling works in our favor." The judge entered, her expression stern. "Before we proceed, I want to address Officer Larson's comments from yesterday," she began, looking directly at him. "If there is information relevant to this case, now is the time to present it. Do you wish to elaborate?" Larson glanced at his attorney, who gave him a warning look. After a long pause, Larson shook his head. "No, Your Honor." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Very well. Let's proceed." Michelle rose to call her next witness, but before she could speak, Larson's attorney stood abruptly. "Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to drop the case." The courtroom erupted into stunned murmurs. Michelle's brow furrowed, and Samuel straightened in his chair. The judge banged her gavel, calling for silence. "Counsel," the judge said sharply, "this is highly irregular. Explain yourself." Larson's attorney shifted uncomfortably. "Given recent developments, my client believes it is in his best interest to withdraw his claims against Mr. Preston." Michelle was already on her feet. "Your Honor, the defense strongly objects. This trial has revealed significant misconduct, and withdrawing now would undermine the court's ability to address these issues." The judge considered this, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. Objection sustained. The trial will continue. Larson's attorney slumped back into his seat, his face pale. Larson, however, stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. As Michelle called her next witness, a retired officer who had once worked with Larson, the testimony painted an even darker picture of his behavior. The retired officer described a culture of intimidation and manipulation within Larson's department, detailing how complaints against him were routinely buried. "Why didn't you report this sooner?" Michelle asked, her tone both curious and sympathetic. The witness hesitated. "Fear," he admitted. Fear of retaliation, not just from Larson but from the entire chain of command. He had connections, people who made sure nothing ever touched him. Michelle turned to the jury, her gaze steady. This is the man who filed this lawsuit. A man who has spent years abusing his power and silencing anyone who dared to speak against him. During the lunch recess, Samuel and Michelle met with Carter in a private room. The internal affairs agent looked more stressed than ever, his usually composed demeanor fraying at the edges. "Larson's not just scared," Carter said. "He's being pressured. We intercepted a message from someone higher up, someone telling him to stay quiet or face the consequences." Samuel frowned. "Do we know who?" "Not yet," Carter admitted. "But this goes all the way to the top. If Larson cracks on the stand, it could expose the entire network." Michelle crossed her arms. "Do we want him to crack? Or do we want to keep him contained until you can build your case?" Carter hesitated. "Ideally, we'd wait. But if he snaps in court, it might force the others to scramble, and that could give us an opening." Samuel considered this. "Either way, Larson's running out of moves. We just need to keep the pressure on." When court resumed, Larson's attorney made a half-hearted attempt to shift the narrative, but the jury's patience was wearing thin. The weight of the evidence against Larson was undeniable, and his credibility had been thoroughly dismantled. Michelle called her final witness, the forensic analyst who had uncovered the doctored video. His testimony was devastating, leaving no doubt that Larson had attempted to manipulate the court. As the analyst stepped down, Michelle turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the defense rests." The judge nodded, her gaze shifting to Larson. "Plaintiff, you may present your closing arguments." Larson's attorney stood, his shoulders slumped. "Your Honor, the plaintiff has no further arguments." The gallery erupted into shocked whispers. Larson's decision to abandon his case was the final nail in the coffin, and the jury's expressions made it clear they had already made up their minds. The judge called for a short recess before closing arguments, and as the courtroom emptied, Larson lingered at the plaintiff's table, his face pale and drawn. Samuel watched him closely, sensing that the officer was on the verge of another outburst. Larson's hand trembled as he reached for his water glass, and for a moment, their eyes met. "You're not walking away from this," Larson muttered, his voice barely audible. Samuel didn't flinch. "Neither are you." During the recess, Michelle and Samuel strategized their closing arguments. Michelle planned to focus on the evidence, ensuring the jury understood the full scope of Larson's misconduct. But as they prepared to return to court, Samuel's phone buzzed. It was a text from Carter. "Larson's panicking. Watch your back." Samuel's stomach tightened. Whatever Larson was planning, it wasn't over yet. When the court reconvened, Larson's attorney announced that they were withdrawing their case entirely. The judge turned to the jury, instructing them to disregard any lingering questions and focus solely on the evidence presented. Michelle delivered a compelling closing argument, laying out the undeniable facts. Samuel watched the jury closely, noting their nods of agreement and their growing disdain for Larson. As the judge dismissed the jury for deliberation, Larson stood abruptly, his face contorted with rage. "This isn't justice," he shouted, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "They're all against me." The judge banged her gavel. "Officer Larson, sit down or I'll have you removed." But Larson didn't move. Instead, he turned to Samuel, his voice low but venomous. "You don't know what you've done." Before anyone could react, Larson stormed out of the courtroom, leaving everyone in stunned silence. Outside, Samuel and Michelle watched as reporters swarmed Larson, their questions flying like bullets. Larson ignored them, disappearing into an unmarked car. "That felt like a warning," Michelle said quietly. Samuel nodded. "And it's not the last one we'll get." As they walked away, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that Larson's parting words were more than just bluster. Whatever was coming next would make the trial look like child's play. The jury returned surprisingly quickly, their expressions grave as they filed back into the courtroom. Samuel sat at the defense table, his calm demeanor masking the tension building within him. Larson, still visibly shaken from his earlier outburst, avoided eye contact with everyone. The judge addressed the foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, standing. The courtroom held its collective breath as the verdict was read. In the matter of Larson versus Preston, we find in favor of the defendant. The gallery erupted into murmurs, a mix of satisfaction and outrage. The judge banged her gavel for order, her voice cutting through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the trial. Court is adjourned." Samuel exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. Michelle gave him a triumphant smile, but the victory felt incomplete. Larson's behavior during the trial, and his cryptic parting words, loomed like a shadow over the win. As Samuel gathered his things, Larson stormed out of the courtroom, brushing past reporters who peppered him with questions. Samuel and Michelle exchanged a knowing glance. They had won the battle, but it was clear the war wasn't over. Outside the courthouse, Agent Carter was waiting, his face tense. "Good work in there," he said, motioning for them to follow him. "But things are heating up. Larson's superiors are spooked, and we've intercepted chatter suggesting they're planning to retaliate." Michelle frowned. "Retaliate how?" "We're still piecing that together," Carter replied. "But Larson isn't just a pawn anymore. He's desperate, and desperate people are dangerous." Samuel nodded, his jaw tightening. "What's our next move?" Carter handed Samuel a file. "We've identified several key players in the network Larson mentioned. Their involvement in this case goes deeper than we thought. We need your help to expose them." Michelle raised an eyebrow. "You're asking us to build another case?" "Not quite," Carter said. "But your win today puts you in a unique position. If we move quickly, we can use the momentum from the trial to pressure these individuals and bring the whole operation down." Later that evening, Samuel sat in his apartment, poring over the file Carter had given him. The names and connections were staggering, a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement. Larson's role was just the tip of the iceberg. As he studied the file, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Congratulations on your win. Enjoy it while it lasts." Samuel stared at the message, his mind racing. He had anticipated pushback, but the direct threat confirmed that the stakes were even higher than he had imagined. He called Michelle, relaying the message. "We need to be careful," he said. "This isn't just about Larson anymore." Michelle's voice was firm. "We'll handle it. But you're right, whoever sent that message isn't bluffing." The next morning, Samuel woke to a barrage of news coverage about the trial. While many celebrated the verdict as a victory against police misconduct, others painted Larson as a victim of a smear campaign. The divide was stark, and the tension in the city was palpable. Samuel's phone rang. It was Carter. "We've got a problem," the agent said, his tone grim. "Larson's gone off the radar." "What do you mean gone?" Samuel asked, sitting up. "He didn't report to his precinct this morning, and his phone's been deactivated. We've got agents tracking his movements, but so far nothing." Samuel's chest tightened. "You think he's running?" "Maybe," Carter said. "Or maybe he's planning something. Either way, stay vigilant." Later that day, Samuel met with Michelle at her office. They reviewed the file Carter had given them, mapping out connections and identifying potential weak points in the network. But the looming threat of Larson's disappearance weighed heavily on their progress. As they worked, Michelle's phone buzzed. She answered, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "What? Are you sure?" she asked, her voice sharp. She hung up and turned to Samuel. "That was one of my contacts at the precinct. Larson's patrol car was found abandoned in a warehouse district on the south side. No sign of him." Samuel frowned. "And the warehouse?" "Empty," Michelle said. "But there were signs someone had been there recently. Whatever Larson's planning, he's covering his tracks." That evening, Samuel returned home, the sense of unease growing with each passing hour. He double-checked his locks and drew the curtains, aware that Larson, or someone connected to him, might try to retaliate. As he sat down to review the case files again, his phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. "You've crossed the wrong people. Time's running out." Samuel's hand tightened around his phone. The message wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. He immediately called Carter, relaying the latest threat. "We'll increase surveillance," Carter said. "But stay alert. Whoever sent that message is serious." The next day, Samuel received a call from one of his contacts, an officer who had quietly supported his case during the trial. "I think you should see this," the officer said, his voice low. "There's a meeting happening tonight, off the books." Larson's name came up. Samuel's heart raced. "Where?" The officer hesitated. "An old factory near the docks. Be careful, it's not safe." Samuel hung up, his mind racing. This was the break they needed, but it was also a risk. He called Michelle, explaining the situation. "You're not going alone," she said firmly. "If Larson's involved, it could be a trap." "Then we'll set one of our own," Samuel replied. That night, Samuel and Michelle parked a safe distance from the factory, waiting for Carter and his team to arrive. The area was dimly lit, the sound of waves lapping against the docks adding an eerie backdrop. Carter stepped out of an unmarked van, his team of agents moving with precision. "We've got eyes on the building," he said, handing Samuel a pair of binoculars. 2 vehicles just arrived. One of them matches Larson's last known location. Samuel peered through the binoculars, spotting a group of men entering the factory. Among them was Larson, his posture tense but defiant. "Let's move," Carter said, signaling his team. Samuel watched as the agents closed in, his pulse quickening. Larson had disappeared for a reason, and whatever was happening inside that factory was about to blow the case wide open. The old factory loomed in the shadows, its broken windows and rusted beams cloaked in darkness. Samuel, Michelle, and Agent Carter crouched behind a stack of crates as Carter's team moved into position. The faint hum of the waves against the docks added to the tension. Through the binoculars, Samuel watched Larson pacing inside the building. He seemed agitated, gesturing wildly as he spoke to a group of men. 2 of them stood out, high-ranking officers Samuel recognized from Carter's file. Their presence confirmed what he had suspected. Larson wasn't working alone. "They're arguing," Samuel whispered, handing the binoculars to Michelle. "This might be their breaking point." Carter held up a hand, signaling silence. His earpiece buzzed with chatter from his team, and he responded in a low voice. "Team Bravo, hold your position. No one moves until I give the signal." Inside, Larson's voice echoed faintly through the open windows. "I've done everything you asked," he shouted, his frustration evident. "But this trial, it's tearing everything apart." One of the senior officers, a burly man with a sharp jawline, stepped forward. "You failed to control the situation. Now we have to clean up your mess." Larson's fists clenched. "I didn't fail. Preston blindsided me. I didn't know who he was until it was too late." The second officer, a wiry man with a cold demeanor, sneered. "Excuses won't fix this. If Preston keeps digging, he'll expose all of us." Carter motioned for Samuel to stay low as the agents began moving in. Michelle whispered, "This is it. If we catch them planning anything illegal, it's over." Samuel nodded, his heart pounding. Larson's desperation was palpable, and the officer's demeanor suggested they were prepared to take drastic measures. Inside the factory, the conversation escalated. "We need to neutralize him," the wiry officer said, his voice cold and calculated. "Preston's a threat we can't afford to leave standing." Larson's face twisted with fear and anger. "You're talking about—" "Do you have a better idea?" the burly officer interrupted. "We've already covered for you more times than we should have. It's time to end this." Samuel's stomach churned. The conversation had taken a chilling turn, and every second felt like an eternity. Carter's voice crackled in Samuel's earpiece. "We've got enough to move. Stand by." Inside, Larson's voice wavered. "If you think I'm taking the fall alone, you're wrong. If I go down, I'm taking all of you with me." The burly officer stepped closer, his tone menacing. "Be very careful, Greg. You're not as untouchable as you think." Carter's team burst into the building, their movements swift and precise. "FBI. Hands in the air." Carter's voice boomed as agents swarmed the factory, weapons drawn. The officers froze, their faces a mix of shock and fury. Larson stumbled back, his hands shooting up in surrender. "Wait. I didn't." "Save it," Carter snapped, moving toward him. "You've got a lot to explain." The burly officer tried to reach for his pocket, but an agent tackled him to the ground. "Don't even think about it," the agent growled, slapping cuffs on him. Samuel and Michelle entered cautiously behind the agents, the tension still thick in the air. Larson's eyes widened when he saw Samuel. "You." Larson spat, his voice filled with venom. "This is your fault." Samuel stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "No, Larson. This is your doing. You thought you were above the law, and now you're paying the price." Larson lunged forward, but the agents restrained him. "You don't understand," he snarled. "They'll come for you too. This isn't over." The suspects were escorted out, their protests drowned out by the flashing lights of waiting police cars and media vans. Samuel stood outside the factory, watching as Larson and the officers were loaded into separate vehicles. Carter approached, his face a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We got them," he said. "And with the recordings, we've got enough to bring down the entire network." Michelle smiled faintly. "That was intense, but it's not just about tonight. What happens next?" Carter nodded. "Next, we untangle the web. This operation goes deeper than just Larson and his immediate circle. But thanks to you two, we've got the evidence we need to start tearing it apart." Samuel exhaled, the weight of the night slowly lifting. "It's a victory, but it's not over." "No," Carter agreed. "But it's a start." Later that night, Samuel returned home, exhausted but resolute. He sat at his desk, staring at the files spread out before him. The victory at the factory had been significant, but Larson's final words echoed in his mind, "This isn't over." As Samuel leaned back in his chair, his phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. "You think you've won. You've only scratched the surface." Samuel's jaw tightened. He had expected retaliation, but the battle ahead was beginning to take shape. Whatever lay beneath the surface, he was ready to face it. For now, justice had prevailed, but the fight was far from finished. The next day, the headlines were ablaze with news of the factory raid and Larson's arrest. Phrases like "police corruption ring exposed" and "high-ranking officers taken into custody" dominated every news channel. Samuel watched the coverage unfold, sipping his coffee with a mix of satisfaction and wariness. The public had latched onto the story, but the shadowy network behind Larson wouldn't stay quiet for long. Michelle called him mid-morning, her voice sharp but measured. "Carter wants us at the federal building. They're processing Larson and the others, and it sounds like they're ready to start talking." Samuel's heart quickened. If Larson or his associates flipped, it could blow the case wide open. "I'm on my way," he replied. At the federal building, the atmosphere was electric. Agents bustled through the halls, their focus razor-sharp. Carter met Samuel and Michelle in a secure conference room, his expression grim but determined. "We've started interrogating the suspects," Carter began, dropping a file on the table. "The two senior officers are tight-lipped, but Larson's already cracking. He knows he's at the center of this, and he's scared." Michelle leaned forward. "What's he given us so far?" Carter opened the file, revealing a series of transcripts and photos. Larson admitted that he was pressured to keep quiet during the trial. The orders came from a high-ranking official, someone with enough clout to bury any investigations that got too close. Samuel studied the photos, recognizing several faces from the trial and Carter's earlier files. "Do we have a name?" Carter hesitated, then pointed to a photo of a man in a suit, his expression cold and calculating. "Deputy Chief Howard Sinclair." Michelle's eyes widened. "Sinclair? He's one of the most powerful figures in the department. If he's involved, this goes higher than we thought." Carter nodded. "We've suspected Sinclair for years, but we've never had enough evidence to make a move. Larson's testimony could change that." While Carter and his team prepared to go after Sinclair, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Larson's desperation during the trial and his cryptic threats suggested there were more players in the game, ones who hadn't yet revealed themselves. As Samuel left the building, his phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. "You've crossed the line. Walk away while you still can." He showed the message to Michelle, who frowned. "They're trying to rattle you," she said. "Don't let them." Samuel nodded, but the unease lingered. The message wasn't just a scare tactic, it was a warning. That evening, Samuel reviewed the files again, focusing on Sinclair. The deputy chief's record was spotless, almost too perfect. Every promotion, every commendation, seemed carefully curated to present an image of unshakable integrity. But Samuel knew that the more polished the surface, the darker the secrets beneath. As he dug deeper, he uncovered a pattern of suppressed complaints and investigations that had mysteriously disappeared. Sinclair's name wasn't on any of them, but the officers involved were all part of his inner circle. The connections were subtle but damning. Michelle called just as Samuel pieced the information together. "I've been going through Sinclair's financials," she said. "There's something you need to see." They met at her office, where Michelle pulled up a series of bank records on her computer. "Look at these deposits," she said, pointing to a series of large, unaccounted-for transactions. "They're all funneled through shell companies tied to Sinclair's associates." Samuel's brow furrowed. "Bribes." "Almost certainly," Michelle replied. "And look at the dates. They align with some of the cases Larson and his crew mishandled. Sinclair wasn't just covering for them. He was profiting." The next morning, Carter called an emergency meeting. "We've got enough to bring Sinclair in," he said, his voice firm. "But it won't be easy. He has allies in high places, and he knows how to play the system." Samuel and Michelle exchanged a glance. They had anticipated resistance, but going after Sinclair would put them directly in the line of fire. "What's the plan?" Samuel asked. "We'll execute a coordinated operation," Carter replied. "Simultaneous raids on his properties and offices to secure documents and evidence. But we'll need Larson to testify if we want a solid case." Michelle crossed her arms. "And if Larson refuses?" Carter's expression darkened. "Then we'll have to find another way." The operation began at dawn. Federal agents swarmed Sinclair's properties, seizing files, computers, and anything that could tie him to the corruption network. The deputy chief was taken into custody without incident, but his calm demeanor suggested he wasn't worried. At the federal building, Sinclair sat across from Carter in an interrogation room, his lawyer by his side. "You're making a mistake," Sinclair said, his voice smooth and confident. "You have nothing on me." Carter leaned forward. "We'll see about that." Meanwhile, Samuel and Michelle reviewed the evidence collected during the raids. Among the files was a ledger that detailed payouts to various officers, including Larson. But what caught Samuel's eye was a name he hadn't seen before, a shadowy figure referred to only as the benefactor. "Who's this?" Samuel asked, pointing to the entry. Michelle frowned. "I don't know, but if Sinclair's answering to someone else, this might be bigger than we thought." As they delved deeper, the pieces began to fall into place. The corruption network wasn't just about Sinclair or Larson. It was part of a much larger operation, one that reached into areas Samuel hadn't anticipated. That night, Samuel received another message from the unknown number. "You've gone too far. The benefactor doesn't forgive." Samuel's grip tightened on his phone. Whoever the benefactor was, they were watching, and they weren't done. The case was unraveling faster than anyone had expected, but the real fight was just beginning. The stakes had never been higher. Sinclair's arrest and the discovery of the benefactor were monumental developments, but Samuel knew they were teetering on the edge of something even more dangerous. Whoever the benefactor was, they held the power to manipulate the system from the shadows, and their reach was vast. Carter's team worked around the clock, analyzing the files seized during the raids. The ledger entries revealed payments and favors that implicated several powerful individuals, politicians, business executives, and high-ranking law enforcement officials. It was a web of corruption so intricate that taking it down seemed almost impossible. Larson was the linchpin. After hours of intense questioning, he finally agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony was explosive. He detailed how Sinclair orchestrated the corruption network, ensuring officers like Larson stayed protected in exchange for their loyalty. But when Carter pressed him about the benefactor, Larson hesitated. "You don't want to go after them," Larson said, his voice low. "They're untouchable." Samuel leaned forward. "Untouchable doesn't mean invincible." "Who is it?" Larson swallowed hard. "I don't know their real name. None of us do. All I know is they fund everything. Bribes, cover-ups, even hit jobs. They're the reason Sinclair and the rest of us could operate without fear." Michelle crossed her arms. "How do they communicate?" "Encrypted messages," Larson replied. "And they use middlemen. Even Sinclair didn't know who they were." As Larson's testimony unfolded, Carter's tech team uncovered a critical piece of evidence, a secure email account tied to Sinclair's finances. Within it were coded messages between Sinclair and a mysterious entity. One message stood out. It was sent the night before Sinclair's arrest and read, "Terminate all loose ends. Ensure silence." Michelle's eyes narrowed as she read the message. This isn't just corruption. This is a criminal enterprise. Samuel nodded. And they know we're coming for them. The team traced the email account to a series of offshore servers, but the trail eventually led to a name, Edward Thorne, a powerful financier with deep political connections. Thorne was known for his philanthropy and public image, but the evidence suggested he was the benefactor. Carter assembled a task force to raid Thorne's sprawling estate. The operation was risky. Thorne's wealth and connections meant he could afford the best security and legal defenses. But Carter was determined to see it through. Samuel and Michelle watched from the command center as agents stormed the estate. The operation was swift and surgical, yielding mountains of evidence, secret accounts, encrypted communications, and detailed plans of the corruption network's operations. Thorne was taken into custody, his calm exterior barely masking his fury. As agents escorted him to a waiting car, he locked eyes with the camera, his expression one of cold defiance. The trials that followed were historic. Larson's testimony, combined with the evidence from Sinclair and Thorne, dismantled the corruption network piece by piece. Dozens of officers, officials, and business leaders were convicted, and sweeping reforms were implemented across the police department. Sinclair received a life sentence, and Larson, though spared the harshest punishment for his cooperation, was stripped of his badge and served a reduced prison term. Edward Thorne, the mastermind behind it all, faced multiple life sentences for his role in the network's crimes. Months later, Samuel stood on the steps of the courthouse, addressing reporters. "This case wasn't just about me," he said. "It was about exposing a system that allowed corruption and abuse to thrive. Justice isn't about protecting the powerful, it's about holding them accountable." Michelle stood beside him, a smile of quiet pride on her face. The journey had been long and dangerous, but the victory was undeniable. That evening, Samuel sat in his apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened. His phone buzzed with a message from Carter. "Thanks for everything. This wouldn't have been possible without you." Samuel smiled faintly, setting the phone aside. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. The fight had been grueling, but it was worth it. Justice had prevailed, and the truth had triumphed over corruption. As he leaned back, his gaze drifted to the city lights outside his window. The battle was over, but Samuel knew the work wasn't done. The world wasn't perfect, but for now, it was a little brighter, and he had helped make it that way.